Hello, world. This is the Know Your Place podcast, and this is episode 16. On this week's episode, I want to talk about the Great American Read that PBS just released, and talk about some of the novels on the list that I think have a very strong identity to certain places in America. Stay tuned. Well, hello everyone. Another week, another podcast. So on this week's episode, I decided to talk about the PBS Great American Read, where they chose 100 novels and they said that they are America's most favorite, although they also made the caveat that they took a series and called them all one novel. So, yeah, I'll leave the link so you can go read and see what go read. You can go look at what the 100 novels are, and they also let you vote on them, and I guess in August they're going to tell you what the winner is, and I don't really care so much about that because it's totally subjective, of course, what the best novel is. I mean, even on my list today, I'm going to talk about, looks like I got like 7 or 8, and these aren't even ones I necessarily consider the best novels on that list. So, yeah. But there's 100, and I did the poll, and I had read 28 of them. Be interesting to see how many anyone else has read. And everybody's going to come in here, well, wait, this is a geography podcast. It's not a literature podcast, so what's the point here? Well, today I wanted to take the geographic angle on it. As you all know, in episode 3, or I believe it was episode 3. No, it was episode 4. I think it was episode 3. Ha! Podcast's already getting too old. I talked a lot about how setting is important in a novel, and of course in geography, geography is all about setting, right? So I did a comparison of novels, French novels set in different novels set in different periods in France, and I thought that was a very interesting sort of concept and topic. But on this week's episode, I wanted to go ahead and go even further, and thankfully PBS provided some content for me to go on. No, I am not endorsed by PBS, so I don't want any kind of issues. I just thought I would take their list and comment on it. So when we talk about settings in literature, in America, it's sort of American novels, or novels that are read by a bunch of Americans, I guess, if that's what the premise of this list was. There's certain novels that you can't remove from where they're set in. You can't take away from the setting. So today I'd like to talk about a few of those, and these are going to be ones that I have actually read because, I don't really feel comfortable commenting on stuff I haven't read personally and have at least some sort of recollection of. So, yeah, so anyway, I'm going to start off by saying I haven't read Gone with the Wind or Grapes of Wrath, so I expect to hear a bunch of people tell me that those have the strongest setting, and how dare you haven't read these. And to that all I have to say is I haven't read them, so anyway. So I decided to start off with one that sort of not a lot of people may have heard about. I certainly hadn't heard about it until my wife had mentioned it. It was like a cult classic that has recently become more popular, and that's why it made this list, I think. And it's called A Confederacy of Dunces. And generally speaking, when I ask people about it, none of them have heard of this book. So you probably haven't if you're listening to my podcast. Maybe you have. Maybe I have a very eclectic crowd. I don't know. But anyway, this book is set in the 60s in New Orleans, and the main character is a very, very eccentric guy. I mean, just completely bonkers and off the wall. And I sort of talked about this this character a bit when I was talking about what we call the town eccentric in one of my other episodes. And because this guy is just so bonkers and off the wall, and in there, like, they talk about things like going down to the bakery, the German bakery, or they talk about going to certain kinds of clubs or establishments, if you will, and they describe sort of the way the streets are, and with like you have to walk into the side to get into this house, and like um, describes the drive out to go to where this guy owns the factory where he lives, and that book, I cannot see New Orleans now without getting some sort of memory of that book. It's impossible for me. There, and I understand that New Orleans probably isn't exactly like that book anymore, but it's hard, man, because they point to so much stuff, and in some ways it's kind of still there. It's kind of still like that, and it's just when the author just laid it out so well and just made it so interesting that I felt totally enthralled the whole time. And I just was like, I felt like I was transported into the French Quarter and running into all kinds of different crazy people. And that's what this guy sort of comes across a whole bunch of his book, and he's one of the crazies himself. Hence why the title is called The Confederacy of Dunces. Anyway, so you have to read this book, and you will not, like I said, you will not be able to see New Orleans a different way after having read this book. And so anyway, the next book I wanted to talk about is The Catcher in the Rye, and I'm sure most everyone has read this book. I'm not sure, maybe some people haven't, but anyway. And the reason why I want to talk about it, and there's multiple books on this list, and there's multiple books in general that talk about New York, and so it's kind of hard to be like, well, I only see New York as I see it in The Catcher in the Rye, but it really snapshots it in the 50s, right? I mean, just sort of all the stereotypes you hear about, like there's this song that was on one of my dad's records, and it's called, it was a song written in the 70s called The Free Electric Band. But anyway, it describes this guy growing up in the suburban East Coast, and his dad wants to go to college to one of these prestigious East Coast places, and he leaves for the West Coast because he wants to be part of the Free Electric Band. Anyway, this book describes the epitome of that kind of culture to me, because it starts out with the lead protagonist at a very prestigious boarding school, not really knowing what to do, and then he goes out and he's sort of running around Manhattan, doing whatever he wants, running into all these different kinds of people, and embracing sort of the coffee shop and the what am I trying to say, like the club culture, and hanging out in the park and going to the museums, and it's hard to sort of separate. Again, you're like transported into New York at the time. So, in the modern day example, of course, the sitcom Friends, kind of was, in my opinion, very much epitomized what we stereotype New York City like, and it's just something there's been lots of movies and books about New York City because it's the biggest city in America. But this one, is one of those that sort of stands out. It's one of the more you're not able to see it without seeing sort of what he describes it like in the 50s. And it's a great book. It is quite a intense read, but it's a great book, and yeah, it's got a very strong sense of setting. So, of course, now we're going to move on to a second book set in New York. I said that's a very popular setting for authors. And I guess it's because also, New York City, while it is a city, it has 5 different boroughs. Within the boroughs, there are different neighborhoods. It's not like it's sort of one all-flat sameness. There is a lot of diversity in New York to write about. And this next book, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, talks about the Williamston neighborhood, which is now today it's sort of become, I would say, it's a place that's really been gentrified in the last few decades based upon the stuff that I've seen about it. And this book captures sort of a different point in time when it was more of a rundown sort of area, and it's sort of like the working class culture growing up there, and it's just they talk about, again, there's all kinds of scenes in the street. I think that's the main thing that really sets a setting, because you could have scenes in a house or scenes in certain things, but you don't feel like you're totally engulfed in a place, and you don't really get that geography connection, the connection to the world that you're in, unless you have all these scenes in the streets of people walking the streets, running into their characters in different places. It just doesn't feel that way. Although the next book I'm going to talk about really doesn't have quite as many street scenes, but so yeah, I remember from a kid, and you have sort of just all the struggles you go through with your typical working class family in a city like New York in the early 1900s, and it's just, it's a fight, it's a battle, and you just wonder if everybody turns out okay. And I guess to some degree they do, but it's again, it's about the struggle. I don't know. I guess why it's so striking to me as someone who grew up as a very little kid in the 90s, and then sort of got into my adulthood into like I graduated high school in 2007. So for me, seeing that different kind of time period where America's always been, there's always been suburbs and things, but to see a sort of stuff written from the perspective of people who were still growing up in the city life is it's very fascinating, frankly, And so the next book I want to talk about is, if I had to take one novel and say, this novel right here, this novel epitomizes America. There is no novel that describes America better than any other novel. I would take The Great Gatsby. Now, I know I'm going to catch some flack for this from some people, but I don't know how you don't just see America when you see this book. And I understand it was set during the Roaring '20s, but I think that's a very American kind of time. Okay, it's set in and I don't feel like I need to describe the plot of this book to anybody. If I do, if there's legitimately somebody who hasn't read this book or been forced to in some kind of class, go read it. I'm not going to describe the plot to you. Spoilers abound. Okay. Anyway. But you have, you have the character Gadsby, who's come from the Midwest, who's who's come from, I guess he came from the Midwest, who's learned all this stuff and managed to work his way up to the top and buy this mansion. But at the end of the day, he doesn't feel anything except for just this desire for this one woman, and I feel like that's kind of how we are in America. We're always chasing that strong thing, and some people, when they get there, it just seems like there's always something more. They're never totally satisfied, and then it's very telling that, in the middle they have that scene where he runs over the woman with the car, right? And it's sort of like they were living in their insular upper class bubble out on Long Island, and they're forced to deal with everyday problems with everyday people all of a sudden, and they don't know how to handle it. And it's just crazy. It's very crazy. It's, again, I think it epitomizes America in a nutshell, and I love it for it. Like, I love the good and the bad of that. I think that's great. I'm very proud of that book. I'm very proud of S. Scott Fitzgerald writing that book. I think it should be. I absolutely think it should be required reading for every high school, and I think it should be how outsiders view America. I really do. It's a wonderful novel. So anyway, the next book I'd like to move on to is I guess a somewhat lighter tone than the other ones on this list. The Call of the Wild by Jack London. Now, I'm a little disappointed because Jack London is one of my favorite authors because he is so great at telling a story and capturing a place in the time. But the book that everybody knows from him is Call of the Wild, and I find it to be one of his sort of lackluster books. I'm not saying it's terrible because he is obviously a gifted writer, but it's, I don't mind the view of the dog and the dog sled thing. It's just it's not as exciting as some of his other writing. But anyway, it also, of course, it captures Alaska. It captures what Alaska was like then in the turn of the century because he went there. He wrote it while he was reporting there. So I think it's another big thing. All these authors who have written these books have a very strong connection to what they're writing about. It's not like they just they're really writing what they experience, and I think that's something that's kind of missed sometimes. I think people don't appreciate that as much anymore, or at least desire it as much, and I think it's really cool. Not to say that I love there's certain science fiction works that were on this list that I love too, but these authors were really capturing a place in a sense of time. And so, Call of the Wild, Alaska, frontiers, dogs, all the issues that comes with living on the frontier. He wrote a lot of other great books about that. One of my personal favorites was the first book he wrote, and it's called Daughter of the Snows, and a lot of people hate it in modern times. So, if you want to be controversial, go read that book. Anyway, so the next one I'd like to move on to is one that I actually was forced to read in school, but I ended up finding it to be very fascinating. It's called The Joy Luck Club, and I'm not sure how many people in this podcast have actually read it. So it's basically about four Asian American mothers and their daughters, and how it all evolves around this game that they play, that they get together to play with the tiles. Oh, what's that called? Anyway, and why I found this so fascinating wasn't because I have a Chinese heritage or anything like that. I don't, but and I do describe myself as German American, but my family has been here for several generations now. But I was, as I said in a previous episode, I was part of a German American Heritage Society. So when I was there, I met several immigrants or children of immigrants, and hearing their stories and sort of what they go through to become part of America, it's just very interesting. It's a different experience, and it's one that really sets a place, right? Because they ascribe, they're often very when they come here, they got these very strong memories that are their first memories of living in America or whatever neighborhood they lived in or whatever people they lived around. And, especially when we're talking about the Asian American community, or we're talking about even some of the German American community, although we've sort of intermingled a lot more than the Asian Americans have in some places. So it's very cool. You hear like, oh, my parents' friend worked at this shop, and they own this, and they made these noodles, and how do we feel about the tourists liking this? Are we sure we want them knowing about our culture, or do we care? All kinds of great things like that. And that book gave me a great insight into that. It really gave me a different sort of respect for that culture than I had before. And I think it's uniquely American. It's a uniquely American experience for the Asian Americans who've moved here. It's one that is not quite the same everywhere else. All right, and moving on to one that I don't need to describe the plot for, because I do think everybody else has read this one or been required to read it. To Kill a Mockingbird. Yeah, that's that's a great book, obviously, and the sort of things I see about it that feel very like Alabama to me, or that area, is that it's sort of like the old house at the end of the road, the Boo Radley house, or like just the way they describe people, and then like the rabid dog scene, and they just come out and shoot it. And I'm not saying that didn't happen everywhere, but it's just like there's a lot of. I feel like when we talk about the southern part of America, and especially somewhere like Alabama, I almost feel like the people are stronger characters. Like the people in the neighborhood are very distinct. They have a very distinct memory. And I'm not saying it's not true of other parts of America, but there's just something about the characters and the way people talk about each other that it just everybody's got a very distinct role, and it's very entertaining, and that's why so many successful novels have been set in those areas. Because it is something you can write about. So, yeah, anyway, To Kill a Mockingbird evokes a strong sense of place, and it takes you to, Alabama in the 50s. So, and then finally, to close this sort of out, another book that I read and I actually really loved when I was in middle school was Where the Red Fern Grows. Now, I'm not sure how many people who listen to this podcast for that book, but it's set in the Ozark Mountains, and it's about this little kid who just wants some puppy dogs really badly and travels these. And it's just these very harrowing feats of climbing mountains to go to a depot to pick up the dogs with $40 and just not owning a car and these long walks and, being poor and very rural, and train them to hunt and, you feel like you're a part of the culture of those mountain people and their struggles, and that's, again, makes for very gripping literature. You're transported into there. I got so, it just, I feel like I'm there when I'm reading it, and I don't know. I don't know why more authors don't have that talent for me in quite the way these people did. And to be honest with you, all of these books that I've talked about here are not modern books. And all of these books are over a half decade old, and we're still talking about them. That really goes to show, how strong they are and how perhaps weak the modern competition is for some of these books. So anyway, tell me what you think in the comments section. Are there any books that evoke a very strong sense of place to you? And did you agree with what I think of the strong sense of place books? There's some I should have included, or you don't think any of these should have been included? Go ahead and let me know. Anyway, talk to you later. Check out the Know Your Place podcast on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/knowyourplacepodcast, all one word, or on Facebook at facebook.com/knowyourplacepodcast, all one word. And we will be coming soon to YouTube and iTunes, and maybe another social media platform near you. Special thanks to my wife, Sarah, and Jay Graff for the riff.